It is a pleasure to greet you all here today for the book launch of the English version of Brazil, A Century of Change. This book was published in Brazil some years back, but it has remained very fresh in its content. We'll hear from two people, from Professor Jerry Davila from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is an associate professor there. One of his focus of his work has been in race relations in Brazil. The second speaker, Professor Davila, was one of the coordinators of this work. One of the editors will be with us. There are three editors. Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro. He is tied up at the OAS. He's a member of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, but he will be here shortly. Today is Venezuela Day there. Yesterday was Brazil Day. Difficult cases being discussed. Paulo Sérgio, let me tell you, it's an honor to have him here. We worked together in 1979 when there was no Workers' Party, when Lula was the Vila Euclides in São Bernardo do Campo, with another important Brazilian by the name of Fernando Henrique Cardoso. They were together fighting for workers' rights, etc., etc. And we met, Paulo and I worked together at Isto É magazine at that time. Paulo later obviously became, among many things, many other things, Paulo became the leader of the center, the director of the Center for the Studies of Violence in São Paulo at the University of São Paulo. He was, under President Cardoso, the National Secretary for Human Rights. It's a very important position, and his field is rule of law, which is a very important and very difficult field in Brazil. So Paulo will join us to talk precisely about his chapter of the book that is about rule of law. But I would like to ask Jerry to start us up with the presentation of the book. If you can give us a little bit of the history of the book and talk about the different contributors, and then Paulo will follow. Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Paulo, especially for the very kind invitation to be here in this event marking the release of this book in the United States. Thanks also to all of you for coming here today. And I look forward to also being on a panel here with Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, who was one of my professors in graduate school. And a number of us Brazilianist historians have had this honor of having had Paulo Sérgio as a mentor in formal and informal capacities. And his influence in academia and the study of Brazil is extensive. And that's one of the things I think that is really terrific about having an English language edition of this volume. Is the list of contributors is really a who's who of a cohort of Brazilian social scientists and policymakers who have, over the past 25 years, been instrumental in carrying out and in interpreting the process of Brazil's transition to democracy and in developing the policies, particularly with regard to questions of social inequality, that have emerged as a very strong consensual position in Brazilian policymaking. And as a historian, one of the things I appreciate about this volume is it recognizes the presence of the past in contemporary Brazilian challenges. A Century of Transformations, A Century of Change, the title suggests both continuities and changes and the presence of a kind of a long dialogue, a long 20th century in mediating the challenges Brazil faces today. And the authors in this volume, they're concerned with both hardware legacies, things like geographic or economic or demographic patterns. But what I think is really interesting is they're also very engaged in the software these legacies, the way in which perceptions of opportunities and constraints have been involved in Brazilian responses to the challenges that are presented here, and the way in which frameworks of cultural values have mediated what is perceived as possible or opportune or essential. And in this regard, this is why I brought this particular slide that's on the screen here. This was a painting created by Ovidio de Melo, who was a Brazilian diplomat who was special representative for the Brazilian government in Angola in 1975. He was sent by Itamaraty, the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, to establish relations with the three movements for independence, which were vying for control of Angola at the moment in which the Portuguese finally yielded sovereignty. And as those groups broke into civil war, his mission changed to establishing relations with whichever one of these movements established an effective national government by controlling the capital, which turned out to be the Marxist MPLA.
Jerry, if you allow me, just since you're talking about Itamaraty, we have the honor to have Ambassador Antonio Patriota with us. And as you refer to that picture there, I remember interviewing Ambassador Ovidio Andrade de Melo in Luanda in 1975. I was a correspondent in Lisbon, went there, and he used to paint at the top floor of the special consulate. I think the special was and the thing was located in between two barracks, one from the MPLA and the other from the UNITA. And, they like to exchange fires over the embassy. And so Ovidio begged Itamaraty, and the Brazilian Air Force brought some steel material to armor the top floor. And that's where he, under fire and listening to it, he used to paint those things. And obviously you can see by the he tried to be very apartisan, but I remember him having a slight preference for the one that ended up being the winner. So he was absolutely right, and he was actually on November 11th, 75, the first ambassador to give to Agostinho Neto the document recognizing Angola's independence. In the official history of Angola, we appeared, I think, in third place, because Russia is first, Cuba is second, and then Brazil. But Ovidio had this very important historic role in 75, which is the year November 75 is precisely the month and the year of Angola's independence. Sorry for
sure. No, this is. I think you set the stage, set the environment really well. This was an extraordinarily difficult atmosphere to carry out a diplomatic mission. The facade of the consulate was repeatedly fired upon. Ivone de Melo, his wife, was responsible for abastecimento, for maintaining food in the consulate for the two of them and for their staff. The Pão de Açúcar supermarket, where she shopped at, was destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade. And she relates picking through the escombros, the remains of the supermarket, in order to keep the supply of food, which eventually had to be replenished once the supermarket was destroyed by Brazilian FABI flights that would bring aid to maintain the supply of rice and beans and other goods in the consulate.
And there was also a Brazilian ship from Lloyd, that had priority to enter the harbor, the port of Luanda, alongside some Cuban and Soviet ships that were bringing the necessary material to fight the South Africans that were coming up the road.
So this Brazilian diplomatic presence in the form of Ovidio de Melo becoming the only foreign diplomatic mission present in Luanda at the time of independence, remaining even after other countries had withdrawn their missions in the course of the fighting, was an act that in many ways was intended to make up for lost time. lost time that was a legacy of the Brazilian government's long support for Portugal in its colonial wars, which had substantially undermined the possibility of developing relations with emerging African nations. And the sense was that at this late hour, this was a final opportunity for the Brazilian government to establish its credibility and its ability to play the role of an honest broker in Africa. The Brazilian relationship with Portugal that made the possibility of relations with Africa so difficult was one that was largely based on sentimental ties, the kinds of sentimental ties defined by people like Gilberto Freire, who suggested that that Brazil's culture, its racial democracy and so on, these were gifts of the Portuguese, and that this meant even if there was nothing to be gained in return, Portugal was one of the most isolated countries in the world in the mid-20th century, Brazil had a filial duty to support the Portuguese. And this way of seeing had public policy implications that committed Brazil to an alignment with Portugal and distancing from Africa. That Ovidio de Mello was one of the key figures in turning around. And in that sense, I find this painting of his really significant because it shows us that software that I'm describing. This scene that you see here is a statue of Camões, the Portuguese poet, being removed from a square in downtown Luanda. And this was an everyday occurrence. As the vestiges of colonialism were hauled away by these trucks, these statues were later placed in an old colonial fort that Luandans referred to as the political prison. And the choice, though, to represent Camões being separated from African soil is, I would argue, a uniquely Brazilian way of seeing these events, that of all of the Portuguese figures being removed, this is the one that is interpreted in Brazil as the essence of the Portuguese contribution to developing a luso-tropical Atlantic that Brazil is a part of. So in other words, this painting captures, it's Paulo Sergio Pinheiro. So in other words, this painting captured a way of seeing which conditioned Brazilian foreign policy. Now this idea of ways of seeing is something that I think the authors do a very creative and resourceful and effective job with in this book. Brazil, A Century of Change, I think, is an exciting book because it captures the nexus between public policy and social scientific thought in Brazil today. As I said, as a historian, I'm particularly interested in the way that the authors work with this question of values. For instance, in their chapter on rural Brazil, Afrânio Garcia and Moacir Palmeira trace the continuities in land concentration and production, particularly in northeastern Brazil, perpetuated by the creation of agricultural institutes during the Vargas period. But they're equally interested in the systems of labor relations and the social relations that conditioned the relationship between rural workers and planters, and how these are renewed by the emergence of the state as a mediator of social and labor relations. Carlos Bresser Pereira similarly explores the legacies of paternalist bureaucratic culture inherited by the Portuguese, part of what Mario Gibson Barbosa, a foreign minister involved in the development of these relations with African countries, would have referred to as the Portuguese mortgage. Other authors like Aspasia Camargo and Paulo Singer emphasize the cycles of centralization and decentralization of nationalism and liberalism. Their recurrence, discussed in great detail in this book, suggests their vitality even at moments in which they most seem absent. This volume was first published in Brazil in 2000, and we're looking at its translation today in 2009. And I think what's exciting about it is I don't think it's lost anything of its timeliness in this past decade, in large part because they reflect the remarkable emerging consensus of social policy and social scientific thought in Brazil, where over the past 15 years the edges of liberal and developmentalist models have softened, and where 7 presidential visits by Lula to Africa have mediated and tended the kinds of ties developed by Ovidio de Mello at the moment he created this painting 35 years ago. So on that note, thank you very much, and Paulo Sergio, it's great to see you.
Sir, the mic is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for being a little late, but I don't want to confirm the cliché that Brazilians sometimes are always late. But as I am the rapporteur on Venezuela, I am in the middle of hearings on Venezuela in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and I thank very much my good friend Paulo Sotelo for organizing this. We have been old colleagues in a wonderful experience that was Isto É magazine in São Paulo. I'm very glad to return to the Wilson Center, where I think I spent one of the happiest years of my life in last century, in 1978, when the center was in the marvelous Smithsonian Castle. And I have very good memories of those times. I think that is important that I thank the Consortium of Latin American Studies of the University of North Carolina that made this big effort of the publication of the book, and the general support a grant from the Brazil Information Center of the Brazilian Embassy here in Washington. And I thank my good friend Antonio Patriotti, the ambassador of Brazil, to be here, and my friend Alexandre Ghisleni from the mission also, that he's there. I was listening to the last part of the presentation of Jerry, then I became aware that the book was published almost a decade ago. But in fact, I think that he has very well captured the nature of the book, because in fact it's a collection of essays by authors that have several connections among them. That is, they were not just contributors invited for a collective book, but in fact it reflects very much a common work among several groups, among I think the 13 authors. I was counting 8 of them have been in the government as ministers, secretaries of state, or candidates to the presidency of the republic in both governments, under Cardoso and President Lula government. And there is this partnership or this complicidade among all these groups, and we have for sometimes worked together in many institutions in Brazil or abroad. Then I think that the book, as Jerry generally said, will survive well, I think. I think that what Jerry has said in his introduction, I think that would be sufficient in terms of the introduction of this debate. But I will say just a few words about my own participation in the book. It's strange in a title where the word change is very much highlighted, that my essay deals with not only change but also deals with continuity. And I quote a sentence by Elizabeth Hardwick, a novelist and one of the founding mothers of the New York Review of Books. And she visited Brazil under dictator General Geisel, and she has this wonderful commentary saying, the centuries seem to inhabit each moment. The diamonds at Minas, the slave ships, Dom Pedro in his summer palace at Petropolis, the liberal tradition, the terrorists, the police, Vargas, Kubitschek, the Jesuits, all exist in a continuous present, a consciousness overcrowded and given to fatigue. And then I decided to elaborate about this sort of continuity in a specific area that is the building of the rule of law, civil and political rights mostly. And I was always trying to elaborate also around a quotation by Faulkner. I think that when he, in his speech, when he received the Nobel Prize, saying, I think that is very appropriate to Brazil. The past was not dead. The past was not really past. This is the sensation in Brazilian society. Then I discussed this continuity in terms of despite all the changes and all the progress in terms of the political change that Brazil has experienced during the century. There is this continuity. What's something that you, in the article I call, now I'm not very comfortable about that, the unrule of law. That is, you have the rule of law, but you have also the shades of a rule of law that persists. Then I try to explain that. I decide to examine not the dictatorships, but the non-dictatorial republican governments. And they are try to establish a rule of law for the majority of Brazilians. And then my intention was to also to review the maintenance, the continuation of the arbitrary exercise of force, of illegal violence by the governments and democratic constitutionalism. A term you recognize applicable only to a very short interregnum between 34-35, the Third Republic of 46, and the New Republic of 1988. The period between the proclamation of Republic 89 to 1930 doesn't really qualify for democratic constitutionalism. We had a constitution, but it would be very difficult to consider a very oligarchic government as a democratic one. Then, but in any way, I also examined the transitions between the several periods that I am discussing. And then I elaborate about the notion that at the end of each arbitrary regime, when we enter a non-authoritarian phase, there is a legacy from this past. Of course, the notion that legacy that I'm debating is not a full legacy, because you have legacies that are stronger than others. Then you have change, because if it will be a full legacy, you will not have at all change. In a characteristic of all these transitions in the Republic is something that a few authors in the past have discussed. It's not a very good translation in English, but I have not found another word, and Robert Anderson has not found a better one. Also, is conciliation. This compromise between inside the ruling class at the moment of each transition. I think that in many of these transitions, the legacy of the past has been underestimated, and consequently, the ability of the oppositions to deal with this authoritarian continuity under democratic government was weakened. Another characteristic that we are facing also, is a very much a discussion of the present, is settling accounts with the past. That is, never in any of these transitions there was an effort to deal with the legacy of the past. The other day there was a public hearing transmitted by webcast on the United States, where the discussion was a truth commission for this country. And then I was having strange thoughts about that. There was a group of NGOs and jurists proposing a re-examination of the recent past of this country. We cannot deny that in several of the past phases, and most particularly after 1988, when we returned to civilian government, that we have improvements in the 5 arenas that I use this from my friend Alfred Steppen and Juan, the 5 arenas considering the civil society, political society, the rule of law, the state apparatuses, and economic society. What happened is that the improvements were not only the main elements present. I tried to discuss in the article that these 5 positive arenas were constantly or are in mediation with or in conflict with other negative arenas. For instance, you have, of course, you have a civil society, but you have behavior of an uncivil society that, if you consider other events inside civil society, like crime, like criminal organizations, you have aspects of civil society that are very uncivil indeed. In terms of the political society, you face some difficulties in terms of the reform of the institutions that came from the authoritarian period. Of course, the article or the essay tries very much to assess what is new and what has not been changed. Of course, the other day, Timothy Garton Arch was preparing his visit to Brazil. He went to Brazil last year. And then we had the discussion, Al Steppen and I and Timothy was saying, when Brazil will have a vibrant democracy? I say, Jim, come on. We have vibrant democracy for at least 20 years. That's not our problem, vibrant democracy. Then we don't have problems in terms of the basic freedoms, in terms, our rate of political murder really is very, very, very short. We know to organize elections. I will not elaborate on that. But all the 5,000 municipalities of Brazil, they have electronic urn that functions very well, tested by the government and by the opposition. But of course, there are some political reforms that have not been made. For instance, in terms of the unbalance between the several populations of the states. There are some details of the political arena that have not been reformed. In terms of the state institutions, I think that the present republic cannot be recognized seen from previous periods in terms of the strengthening of the public prosecutor's office, the federal prosecutor's office, the establishment of ombudsmen in many states for the police. But of course, the public security institutions are the same as in the dictatorship. The democracy, for instance, was able to transfer under Cardoso, but with the support of the Workers' Party, that the crimes of the military police in each of the states, the military police has not to do with the army, but is a patrol, is the ostensive police branch, now are reviewed by civilian courts. But the investigation of those crimes, homicides practiced by military police continues to be investigated by something that's very strange, inquéritos investigated by the military police itself. That is something very strange. I must say that the essay deals much more with civil and political rights than about economic and social rights. Even if in the last period, since '88, we have seen a very important innovation in terms of the rights of the child, in terms of access to health. Brazil, as you know, has one of the best programs of support a program of care for HIV/AIDS patients, a free program established that began to be established under President Sarney. But of course, there were important improvements in terms of people in extreme poverty. There are very successful programs in the present administration and the previous administration that have addressed this. I think that the in terms of the black population or populations of Afro descent, I think that the democracy made an outstanding contribution. But of course, the inequality between blacks and white continues very high. Then I think that the conclusion of the essay is that we have this sort of chiaro escuro, that at the same time that we have to acknowledge formidable developments, there is a lack of some structural reforms that have not been yet implemented. Then, of course, when we decided to translate the book, Inácio Sachs, George Wilhelm, and I, we decided not to change dramatically the essays, because it will be another book, and it will sound strange that we try to cope with the post-Cardoso years. And I think that we take the right decision, and listening to Jerry, I'm convinced that it was the good decision, and that my essay and the others, as Jerry said in the introduction, there is this very consensus in terms, that is a big progress in terms of the democratic game that is played in all Brazilian. There is only this game, the democratic game in society, and I think that others will try to cope with the future that we have not dealt. Okay, well, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Paulo. Before we open for questions, just a note of remembrance of Gilberto Dupas, one of the contributors to this volume who passed away about and Celso Furtado, also the two contributors. I mentioned Gilberto Dupas because he passed away a couple of weeks ago in São Paulo. Was dear to many of us, and a great intellectual. Was very interesting, the reaction, because the eulogies, but they came from far and wide, everybody from different areas of the political debate, because he was one of the leading intellectuals debating globalization in Brazil, which is precisely the topic of the book here, his chapter. Norman, why don't we start? Norman Bailey.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me express my appreciation to Paulo Soltero for convening a meeting of this type The Woodrow Wilson Center, for obvious and understandable reasons, has a tendency to have programs about the problems of the day, housing policy in Santa Catarina or something of that sort, rather than meetings of this type, which go much more into depth with reference to the countries being studied. I'm going to make a suggestion based on my not very pleasant recent experience of hearing a high-level U.S. government official whose motivations were excellent. He was trying to demonstrate how peaceful Brazil is and how it can help all, in MINUSTA and Haiti and so on and so forth. He made the following statement. After its war for independence, quote unquote, Brazil never fought a war with any of its neighbors, nor took any territory from any of them. Now, this abysmal ignorance of Brazilian history leads me to make a suggestion to those present, and that is, I think it's very important to support the establishment of centers for Brazilian studies, which would include, obviously, history, sociology, political science, economics, and so on and so on, as well as the Portuguese language, because you can say that most Americans, whether politicians or not, are ignorant of Spanish America. Their ignorance of Brazil is almost total. And this is just a suggestion after hearing this gentleman make all kinds of totally false statements about Brazilian history.
Yeah, actually, there was no war of independence.
No, of course
And there was one war.
There was one.
there were two.
There was one. Yes.
In the 19th century, there were two wars.
Questions? Yes.
Chechen freelance correspondent. I have been looking for a long time a book like this, and so today I got very happy. I just very briefly skimmed this book. I have a couple questions. First is this: it said diplomat relation with the Latin American country have to go through U.S. and why? And it's still the way now. And also, forgot my ignorance. Is Brazil still in the IMF, World Bank, and WTO? And then is what's the effect of the globalization on Brazil? And how is land reform going on? And particular to Professor Pinheiro, I just quote your last sentence in your book. More than a century after the proclamation of the Republic, Brazil still must break with the past. It's on page 209. And I would like to see what do you mean the past, and also that what have been done on this, and what do you think going to do, what have to do in the future. And one last question is this: what are the major change from 2000 to 2009? Thank you.
I would ask the ambassador to address the question about what the Brazil relations to Latin America go through the United States. I think it may have been true in the past. I would not recognize that as being our policy, but I would like to ask the ambassador to.
Well, I wasn't really I was intending more to listen than to speak, but
Here you work.
but I can't resist also one general comment, which is, well, first of all, congratulate the authors of the book and my dear friend Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro for their participation. It's always useful, I think, to bring together people of this caliber and to have them write about a country that I agree is relatively little known in the United States. I think one of the reasons is that the United States is not really a big soccer fan. Although this is changing quickly thanks to the feminine gender, especially here in the U.S. But it's true. It's true that I can see that, for example, in the United Kingdom and France, there is a more automatic connection to Brazil because children grow up knowing the names of Brazilian soccer players, which doesn't happen here. But be that as it may, the thought that occurred to me is that you could argue, maybe stretching a little bit, the argument that in the past 8 or 9 years, there's been as much change in Brazil as over 100 years before that, because what is very striking is the acceleration of the pace of change in Brazil, I think, in the past decade or so. And as a diplomat who has been representing Brazil for the past 30 years, I feel this very, very acutely in my everyday work, in the way that Brazil is treated by foreign interlocutors and the interest that Brazil generates because of whether it's its energy policies, whether it's the social programs that have been taking millions of people out of poverty, whether it's the foreign policy and the diplomatic initiatives. So perhaps in the future someone might take up the challenge of writing a book about the first 10 years of the decade we are now experiencing, and that would be a very interesting project as well. But just to comment briefly on whether our relations with the rest of Latin America pass through the United States, I think the whole of the Americas, the entire hemisphere, as they say here, more than in Brazil, we don't really use this concept of hemisphere that much. We use more the idea of the Americas, which include the notion that it's a very diverse region. There are many Americas. There's a Spanish-speaking, a Portuguese-speaking, an English-speaking, a Dutch-speaking, a Quechua-speaking, etc. But we were all very strongly impacted by the Monroe Doctrine for more than a century, I would say. And this was a notion that came through I think, genuine desire that has something that we all can identify with at the root of establishing our own parameters for diplomatic relations as opposed to those of the old continent of Europe. But of course, we know that this also led to, well, I think it wouldn't be exaggerated to say imperialistic attitudes on the part of the most prosperous nation in the Americas and the most extreme manifestation of that, of course, was the Teddy Roosevelt period. But what we experience in more recent decades is something completely different. And I think a growing awareness, first of all, of the specificities of different sub-groups within the Americas, and the importance of dealing with challenges through cooperation that is autonomously organized and coordinated. So it would be absurd, for example, to deal with the problems of the Amazon region by relying on any outside participants. Those are problems that concern first and foremost and the countries that share the Amazon basin. So you could trace back to the Treaty of Cooperation for the Amazon region, one manifestation of this desire to take up your own destinies in your hands through increased cooperation. And that was, 25 years ago or so. Yeah. And more recently, you would have, an example from scarcely 2 weeks ago when the South American Defense Council was established. So this also manifestation of South America rising to the challenges of closer cooperation in the defense field to not only improve the knowledge and understanding among all the military establishments of the different countries, but hopefully also prevent tensions that might arise from degenerating into armed conflict or episodes such as the ones that we witnessed recently between Colombia and Ecuador. So there is a trend towards more autonomous behavior, and this is not done necessarily as an impulse that is against anyone else. It's just a question of emancipation, I think, is maybe a good word to use here, and realizing that if you don't take care of your own problems and if you don't assume your own responsibilities, it's not natural to expect others to do that. Much is said in analytical studies in the press and others about whether Brazil is seeking a leadership role or not. The way I like to describe it is Brazil assuming its responsibility within the South American context, especially. If you look at a map and you see that Brazil represents half the landmass, half the population, half the GDP, more or less, it would not be reasonable to expect Chile or Peru or Paraguay or even Argentina, the second largest country in South America, to try to bring the countries together into common goals, whether it's for greater economic and trade cooperation, greater security cooperation, or any other goal. So Brazil would be, in fact, foregoing its responsibilities if we did not look very carefully at the neighborhood and try to establish links of cooperation. So this is the motivation behind I think, unprecedented effort to establish an agenda for South America as a distinct geographic, political entity, one that is today marked by democratic governments, different types of democratic governments, but I think one essential element is present in all of them, which is the fact that they're democratically elected, and very concerned with the what could be described as the main challenge of the region, which is overcoming inequality, overcoming poverty. So all the governments with a very ambitious social agenda. I think I'll stay around here.
And just before I pass the word to Paulo, yes, Brazil is very active in the WTO, member of the IMF, member of the World Bank, and if the leaders at the G20 finally come to their senses, they may, in the reform of the financial system, do away with the rule according to which the president or the leader of the IMF has to be an European and the leader of the World Bank has to be an American. It doesn't make sense anymore. And if that rule is discontinued, you will probably see in the next 5 to 10 years some very smart Brazilians running for maybe leadership positions in not only the two organizations, but also the third one, the WTO, where Brazil has remained very, very active. Paulo.
Very briefly, I was trying to figure out what I was thinking when I said the past. But the past is very much the negative legacies. For instance, today the New York has a cover about torture. Dealing with common prisoners, not torturing, legalized torture in Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, but common torture. I think that there are several challenges in terms of civil rights that, to be fair, all the governments since Sarney have addressed this difference between the Constitution, the express rule of law, and the real practices. I was thinking about the question of inequality for people of Afro descent. I think that this government and the previous government had very original initiatives in terms of the promotion of people of African descent. There are today a large program of scholarships for people of African descent. But of course, in terms of inequality, the levels are extremely high. A good continuity, I think, for the democratic period is a continuity in terms of human rights policies. I think that is very civilized that the present government is preparing in a very professional way the TED, the National Plan for Human Rights. I was involved with the first and the second. And the present Minister for Human Rights is preparing the TED after a fantastic mobilization in all the states, a great team. And I think this shows a certain maturity of our democracy. I was telling the other day to Antonio Patriot that he knows that being for, let's say, 14 years in the United Nations, Geneva, New York, it's fantastic how Brazil is considered an honest broker in terms of all the human rights bodies. We have a standing invitation for all the special rapporteurs. The federal government is a wonderful interlocutor for these rapporteurs. Just an anecdote, I remember Nigel Rodley, the former rapporteur on torture, came to Brazil, and he was so warmly received in Brazilian, and he couldn't understand that because the problem is not with the federal government. There are a lot of problems with the states of the federation. But I think this is a dimension that is one of the dimensions that I follow here. That there is improvement and there is continuity since the return to. This doesn't mean that the human rights situation has magically been transformed, but institutional changes and incredible dynamics in civil society.
Paulo Sergio, my name is John Barr. I'm at the World Bank Group, and I still live in São Paulo and do watch you on TV very often, so it's nice to see you in person. I have a question about the present crisis. Which kinds of structures and traditions in Brazilian society will help the country the most navigate this period, and which will be the most affected, the most complicated as we go through this very severe crisis?
I think Antonio Patriota can answer that because I was thinking, excuse me, in the last 4 years I was not in Brazil, then I'm not following very closely what is happening. I'm not competent at all about that, but I think that there are many social policies that will help the population as a whole to face this crisis. But I think there are some specificities that I will not dare to say, some specificities in terms of the situation of the Brazilian economy at this moment. Because of the present policies, because the size of our reserves, and but perhaps Patriot would like to say something about that. But for instance, I am enthusiastic of the Bolsa Familia. How do you say Bolsa Familia? I forgot in English. It's a complementary income for the very poor with some conditionalities. How to say?
Family support.
Yeah, family grant. There is a conditionality. I must say that who invented that is here in this. The first one to establish was Cristóvão Buarque, who was the first Minister of Education of the Lula government, and then the Cardoso government. Now the Lula
invented as governor of the federal district
of Brazil. That was his idea was floating very much in the air, Senator Suplicy and all that, but he was the first to implement. I think that this is so powerful, and I have read many stories about the beneficiaries of this. Some criticism also. I think it is 11 million families receiving this. This is extraordinary support. But perhaps Antonio would like to say some more competent.
What I was really thinking was perhaps mention the question of crime.
Okay.
Social cohesion.
That is, someone was saying about the violence in Brazil. I think that it's fair to say that violence is not spread all over Brazil. If you take this for you, if you take crime, violent crime, the very high rates in homicides, that by the way they are going down, they are in the 9 metropolises areas. You don't have. Even in terms of social conflicts, people dying in terms of rural conflicts are less than 100 in combining Cardoso and much less 50 or something by the Pastoral da Terra. Is very independent observer. I think that there is a big problem in terms of the periphery of the metropolises and the frontiers of Brazil, where you have something that I was oscillating to call. Usually, I call associated state, because in fact you have a lot of corruption, several levels of the state apparatus. And I was reading the other day a wonderful book that I recommended by G.M. Coetzee, A Diary of a Bad Year, where he used the expression bandit state apparatus. This is a problem of the presence of the expansion of the narco traffic. Of course, the federal state under Cardoso, under Lula, for the first time ever in the Brazilian Republic, they have national plans of public security with a lot of professionalism. But this is a challenge. The frontiers, São Paulo, the periphery of São Paulo and the hills of Rio are controlled by the narco traffic. For instance, we had this problem in the last elections that the main electoral tribunal was obliged to call the army to protect some campaignings. But if just so I finish with this comment saying, what are the present challenges? I think organized crime, real organized crime. Not disorganized crime, but reorganized crime. I think that is but it's not a problem of the executive. It's because of the judiciary. The judiciary has not a policy priorities in terms of what to do. I think the absence of the real reform of the public security apparatus. No government there to do anything about that. I understand it's when you have a military force of more than 300,000 military police and men and women in arms, the armed force in Brazil has 300,000. We have a problem. And this is also the last thing that I'll say. This also is something that I discuss. Is the profile of political power of the government in Brazil under Sarney or Itamar Franco, Cardoso, Lula, that the president has to count with the right, if we can, the very conservative force that sometimes are in the control of the states. This is not static; it's a dynamics, and it will be not fair. It will be not fair to say that it's a problem of this government, because the previous government faced the same problem.
And then to just add, one of the things that Paulo Sergio points out that's really important is the diversity of experiences then in a country of Brazil's size. So you mentioned the situation with frontier cities.
Yeah.
One of the organizers, Jorge Wilhelm, has a terrific chapter in this book about the emergence of these frontier metropolises and the oftentimes violent competition generated by the insecurity of land tenure in these boom towns that are emerging even right now in the kind of innermost agricultural frontiers and areas of settlement in Brazil, which are a very different dynamic of violence than what you see taking place in cities.
I think Jerry, sorry, Paulo, Jerry is very right to remind this. It's very difficult to deal with Brazil. I think that you have very much to tackle different situations, because we are is a very large and this diversity will help in explanation that we cannot have. And I think this is, if I can say, another quality of this book, that we try very much to deal with this regional disparity in Brazil.
It's very good that you said that. I very often get this question, what do you in Brazil think about, as if we think all the same? 200 million people, there are maybe 200 million ways of thinking about stuff. But Ambassador Alec Watson.
Alec Watson from Hills and Company. And I haven't had an opportunity to look at this book. It seems to me that is an institution which is fundamentally important to overcoming inequality, to empowerment, to social integration, etc. And I can remember, I think it was Elio Jaguaribe that said years ago, he called Brazil a cartorial state. And he said that with a negative connotation. And I wonder if you guys, the authors of this book, have touched on this whole dimension of the Brazilian political scene, or if not, if somebody else is working on that.
I may react quickly. No, I would be the author supposed to deal with that, and I have dealt in a certain way. That is, we are very far away from the cartorial state that we had a lot of improvement. First, because of the 1988 Constitution, I think that it's a different federal state, in terms of because you know that in Brazil we have the same structure as here. We have a federal judiciary and a state courts and a public prosecutor. All we have at the federal and state. There was an enormous strengthening of the competence of the federal prosecutor. For instance, new areas like health, indigenous peoples, the environment, areas that the judiciary never acknowledged in the before '88. There was a recent, very important improvement that was the creation of the Conselho Nacional da Magistratura, a national body to oversee the judiciary. It was an old request from civil society. Finally, this was implemented. The number of judges has not dramatically improved. Our rate, the number of judges compared to the population is very rare. If you compare to this country or if we compare to Europe, then we have a problem. But I will say that there was a great changes in the civil society that discovered the judiciary for litigation. We have learned a lot with this country in terms to fight discrimination, to promote the rights of the people of African descent. I think that the perceptions that is utility of the judiciary has been dramatically highlighted in the process. Is one of the big, I think it continues to be one of the big weakness, but it would be unfair to say that we continue at Jaguaribe's time. No, please, we change the law.
Just to add two things that happened, the Supreme Court, the caseload of the Supreme Court in Brazil is down by half, because now we have the precedent. Súmula vinculante, there are reforms adopted, and also the Supreme Court in Brazil, until 3 years ago, it could not choose cases. It had to hear everything. And now they have like here, it's not 1,000 cases per year, and they hear 100. We are in thousands still, but I think there are reforms that are making it more efficient.
And a footnote, they have discovered international law, as the Supreme Court here also in the judging some. Now I think the judges became much more aware.
Margaret?
I want to echo Norman's comment. It's very nice to be able to talk about Brazil again. I had the pleasure of being the deputy director of the first Center of Brazilian Studies in this city many years ago. We didn't have government support then. And I remember that I'll never forget, as mayor, one of our first conferences was about Brazil's role in South America, and whether Brazil would play a leadership role, and all of the presentations by academics from other countries described a relationship which reminded me most of other countries like Mexico talking about the United States and commenting that really worried about Brazil's power in the hemisphere. So it's good to see you challenging that issue again. Ambassador, the DC United tried to get a Brazilian backfielder, and but I have a question. perhaps the issue of this issue of police reform, rule of law, and police reform is one of the most critical issues affecting cities around the Americas. And you mentioned, Paulo Sergio, that the police institution had not changed, and that this was one of the, unlike the evolution of some of the others. Our vision of the Brazilian police now comes from the movies, Tropa de Elite, and I read that book in Portuguese, published in Portugal, and I was very pleased that I could understand it. And two, I noted that the Portuguese put footnotes to explain the What would be your thoughts if you were addressing the Peruvians, the Mexicans, etc., on even Argentina, on the steps that are needed, the pitfalls to be avoided in police reform to address this question of violence? Are there lessons to be taken from the Brazilian experience?
Thank you, Margaret. I don't think that it would be fair that there was no change. What I was specifically referring is that the basic structure continued the same. That is, we have a civilian police and we have a military police. We continue having police-military cuts. And there is almost unanimity. Experts are unanimous in saying that this is not practical. Inside both of the police, you find also people saying that this is not useful, is not the best structure. But as I was explained, this is very hard to manage inside the parliament because of the presence of this very large body. I saw Tropa de Elite. It's a film that impacted me very much. I think that's not fair for the police. It's fair for Rio de Janeiro. Rio de Janeiro is a disaster in most of the police. But if you take São Paulo, the film will not be the same. And I think that even in Rio is a very specific situation of that group, and the actor is fantastic. But it's a dangerous film because some people were very happy that people were being tortured. Then it's complicated. You ask me one thing. One thing is accountability. This word that doesn't exist in Portuguese. Accountability for the oversee civilian control of the police. There are several efforts, not only in the south, in Belém do Pará, for instance, there is an excellent ombudsperson for independent ombudsperson with mandate, etc. And in the academy, in the university, my own center is commemorating the 20th anniversary, and for 20 years we are dealing with this. And I would like also to mention that I am coordinating a report by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on police citizen security, human rights requirements in police strategies. Then I think that all the continent needs more accountability. I think if I have to choose one thing, it would be prestar contas, to make police. It is a problem here in this country. New York, there is a very good story of civilian control, but with an oscillation of several crimes. Then I think that for the continent this is a problem. The Brazilian police in São Paulo and Rio has a small problem because they kill too much people. And I'm repeating this for all the governments, and it's not the responsibility of the federal government, for sure, because the federal government doesn't kill anybody. But it's a problem and you have very high crime, and people think that this is effective, but it's not effective. But this is a problem of Rio, São Paulo. It's not Brazil.
There's a book I wish we could see translated, written by Luis Eduardo Soares. Meu Casaco de General, My General's Coat. He's an anthropologist from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who in the late 1990s was appointed by the governor as advisor for public safety and his police reform goal was to create unified systems of data collection for all of the different police forces, crime rates, other types of criminal or police action, so that it would become possible to put together the sort of data that allows for accountability. And this meant that he naturally faced every obstacle to that transparency that you can imagine, and eventually left the position. Now, he wrote a book that really is something of a personal ethnography of his experience trying to conduct this reform and his growing understanding of the diversity of actors that were trying to impede its being carried out.
That is to give a happy ending to this story. This has been implemented in many systems of sophisticated information about crimes in Rio and São Paulo. And Luiz Eduardo Soares also did the first police program for the Lula government, and this had a very positive influence, to say.
I believe he is the author of the book that inspired Tropa de Elite. Co-author of that. One thing, Margaret, as you mentioned, President Lula, after meeting President Obama here 10 days ago, mentioned something that caught my attention, which is an initiative in South America of the governments to coordinate anti-drug policy, which, you know, this is a problem we have in common. The police corruption and political corruption, it's all tied together, and maybe that effort will lead to more cooperation also, because I assume that the problems are very similar.
Of course.
In all the...
Yeah, I guess I wanted to add another happy note to the story, and I'm picking up on what Jerry was saying, that the enormous diversity in Brazil and the enormous diversity within even the same institutions. Working in Sao Paulo between 96 and 2000 as the cultural attaché, we shifted the program towards social program, which was difficult, but we did it. And there were so many positive experiments going on in Sao Paulo. I remember Belisario Santos, who was working on developing community policing in association with a whole lot of other state institutions that were put together in the middle of favelas. I think he created around 4 of those. There was Ana Sofia Oliveira, who was working with the police to get them to stop killing people, and she wrote a number of books on this particular subject. But there were so many good people. The Núcleo was involved with a lot of these projects. The United Nations project, I forget the young fellow's name. He was wonderful, just a dynamo at pushing these issues. But you could find so many. People would say, "Well, you're working with police," and I said, "You won't believe it, but this is a very, very encouraging thing that's happening in Sao Paulo right now. I don't know, what's happened to Belisario Santos and his community one-stop shopping social service program, but the notion of community policing was big in Recife.
Paulo Mesquita, no?
Yeah, okay, and it was big in Recife, and the people at the embassy, Alex, would tell me there's no such a thing as community policing. It's a concept, but it doesn't exist. And I talked to the security people and within the embassy, and it was like talking to the people from outer space. And they looked at me, of course, as if I myself was from outer space, and maybe I am from outer space. But anyway, my origins are somewhat dubious. But I think that Brazil offers. There are several concrete models, not just the Bolsa Familiar, but there's a whole bunch of things going on in Brazil that are far superior to the kinds of projects that we put in place in our inner cities, in Los Angeles, in New York, Houston. A great deal could be learned rather than bringing experts from America to Brazil, to bringing Brazilian experts to the United States. And I hope Alex sees some possibilities in this, or has some of this thing in action. We do some of it, but the diversity issue, especially, you look at the worst and the most violent and heartbreaking conditions, and you see that people are working day by day.
Yeah, there has been some
This is
positive
new.
exchanges. Yeah, I think Brazilians, some of the experiences in Rio have been brought to Haiti, for instance. Viva Rio has done very interesting work in that regard. More questions? If yes, please. We have time for one.
My name is Mary Mullen. I just was visiting. I just have friends in Brazil, and I've been there. I was just curious about the United Nations in Brazil. Weren't they considering making Brazil a permanent member of the Security Council, or what's happening in that arena?
I think
That's our issue.
I think that Ambassador Patriota is more qualified to.
Yes.
Well, there's a 5-minute answer, there's a 5-hour answer.
Give it the 5 minutes, please.
The 2-minute answer. Well, Brazil is very engaged with the United Nations, and we're very happy that President Obama has given indications that he will also be placing greater emphasis on effective multilateral institutions. In fact, when he presented his foreign policy team, I think it was one of the 3 priorities that he mentioned. He mentioned the Middle East, he mentioned non-proliferation, and he mentioned strengthening multilateral institutions. Now, when you think of strengthening multilateral institutions, it really become very acutely aware of some of the inadequacies of the current mechanisms and the fact that they were designed after World War II for a very different geopolitical environment than the one we live in today. It's been difficult to crack the nut of the Security Council reform, a process that began in the early 90s. Initially, Brazil became very actively involved in this whole debate because there was a sense that not only could the Council remain not, let's say, unrepresentative and illegitimate in the eyes of the world, but some distortions in representation could become even more acute. There was a moment in the 90s where the idea that Japan and Germany could join as permanent members without additional permanent members gained some strength. And this is one of the reasons that motivated Brazil and India to become very much involved, because we feel that, well, if you're going to start looking at representation, what really strikes the attention is the absence of any permanent representation from Latin America, from Africa, and a disequilibrium in that regard. Whether we will be able to achieve the kind of reform that we would like to see is difficult to say, but I think there's a growing sense when you look at developments such as the G20 meeting here in Washington last November, and the fact that G20 is being used now as a locus for coordination on economic, financial issues, that the present structures need some reform, and in that sense, if you just read the press and most analysis and most observers around the world would agree that it would be desirable to have representation from the so-called emerging countries, and Brazil is often mentioned as a candidate in that regard. I think Brazil has presented himself as a country ready to take up greater responsibilities and has demonstrated, first of all, in its immediate neighborhood that we live in peace with all our neighbors. We are not a nuclear power. We're not expansionist anymore, if we might have been indeed in the 19th century, and also taking up very strong action in terms of peacekeeping. Haiti is a good example, and very much inclined towards peaceful settlement of disputes, diplomatic resolution of conflict rather than military interventions. I think all of these characteristics, in addition to size, economic relevance, and others, places us relatively well, but it's a difficult political process.
Well, with that, I would like to thank you all very much for coming. Thanks, Paulo Sergio, Jerry, Ambassador Patriota, and stay tuned to our website for announcements of events. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.